Okay, see folks are still trickling in, but we'll get started. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Understanding BC's Community Generation Potential, streaming to you from traditional and unceded lands of the Syilx peoples of the Okanagan Nation. My name is Dave Cassian, and I'm a current volunteer with the BCSEA and past board member. For those of you not familiar with the BCSEA, we are a volunteer-led network of action takers supporting sustainable energy policy, innovation, and education in British Columbia. We play an active role in policy at the BC Utilities Commission and engage across the province through local chapter events. The BCSEA also offers the Cool It education program, which empowers students in BC to become sustainability champions through interactive classes offered to both elementary and high schools. Today's webinar will take approximately 1 hour with an opportunity for you to ask questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We welcome side discussions and collaborations, so feel free to post resources and supporting information you may have regarding today's topic through the Q&A function. If you can't find where the Q&A button is at the bottom of the Zoom ribbon on your screen there, press the More button to locate it there. We are recording this webinar and it will be available for streaming on the bcsea.org news page within a few days. So with that, welcome. This webinar will introduce the UBC Energy Mapping Project, which supports community energy planning in BC through resource mapping and spatial analysis. The UBC Energy Mapping team will present early findings on the generation potential of rooftop and utility scale solar in BC and share plans to co-develop mapping tools with communities. The webinar will also provide an overview of BC Hydro's Community Generation Service Rate, which comes into effect on July 1st, 2026, and allows community projects to export up to 2 megawatts of power to the grid. We'll share relevant questions for communities to consider and invite a dialogue in the Q&A. We're also looking forward to hearing from you. Your questions, ideas, and perspectives are all a vital part of this conversation. The UBC Energy Mapping Project is an accelerating community energy transformation, or ACET project, led by research associate Connor McGuckin. The team includes recent Master of Geomatics for Environmental Management graduates Tyler Gonsalves and Mackenzie Thompson, who are working to model rooftop and utility scale solar potential in communities across the province. They are joined by postdoctoral researcher Annie Russell, who has recently supported ACET researchers and partners to prepare for BC Hydro's community generation rate. So to the Energy Mapping Project team, welcome and thank you for your time. The floor is now yours.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Dave. And yeah, thanks to Cindy and Neil as well in the background for helping get this set up. We're very happy to be here today to share some of our work. Yeah, thanks for everybody for taking their time as well to listen to us. I'll get started with a little bit of a background on the project, but before I get into that, I want to do our land acknowledgement. We're joining you from the University of British Columbia on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. But of course, our work is also province-wide, so it takes place across the 204 First Nations across BC and the unceded and traditional territories of all the many distinct nations that we have here. It also includes a local case study on Kamloops, which is on the Tk'emlúps to Secwépemc territory within the unceded ancestral lands of the Secwépemc Nation. We want to recognize that energy planning and land use is very closely tied to Indigenous sovereignty and stewardship. And I think we can learn a lot from First Nations in our relationships with each other and then also with the land and the world around us. So just to step back a little bit, we'll talk about what ACET is, Accelerating Energy Transformation, Accelerating Community Energy Transformation. It's a Canada First Research Excellence Fund initiative, which brings together a series of universities from across Canada. So we are quite focused within BC, but we also have partners within Quebec and the Yukon. And we're trying to expand across Canada, looking at rural and remote communities and what we can do to support energy transition there. And then also more recently looking internationally as well and how we can build collaboration across, the globe on this issue of community energy. To talk then briefly about what our specific project within ACET looks at, we've got a few goals. One of them is looking at the community energy and emissions inventory and what we can do to improve spatial representation of emissions and energy demand within communities. The other part, which we're going to talk mainly about today, is mapping renewables across the province with focus on wind and solar energy and how these line up with existing energy infrastructure. And then, so we also have mentioned the maps of the energy demand and emissions. And then, the purpose of this overall project is to identify communities' unique challenges where there's high energy demand, but also a lot of opportunity in the cases of renewables. So what we're going to talk about today has two parts. Firstly is the utility scale wind and solar, looking at sites above 1 megawatt, so 5 acres. Anywhere that's about that site could house 1 megawatt and beyond as a utility scale grid connected wind or solar farm. It's a province-wide assessment, and it uses an AHP survey, which is a multi-criteria way to decide what's the most suitable land areas. Kenzie will talk a lot more about that later. And then we also have a rooftop solar assessment, which is focused on the city of Kamloops purely for the purposes of simplifying our computational load and the amount of data processing we need to do. This is looking at how we can use LiDAR data, which is quite readily available across the province and is increasingly being developed for the province through a BC provincial government project initiative to develop over the next 6 years detailed LiDAR for the whole province. So we're hoping if we can have a model that's open source and uses these open LiDAR portals that works very well in Kamloops, it could be applied elsewhere. I'll now hand over to Tyler to talk a bit more about that rooftop solar mapping.
Howdy folks, I'm Tyler. Excited to be talking to you all today. A bit of background about myself before we jump into it. As mentioned, I just finished my master's in geomatics, but I also have extensive experience in software development with 4 years of professional experience and a BSc in computer science. During my master's, I did a project exploring potential rooftop solar resources in Kamloops, and since then I signed on with the team here at UBC to continue and extend the research, which is what I'll be running you through today. So generally speaking, BC's rooftop solar resources are underexplored and underutilized. Rooftop solar inventories at a municipal scale are uncommon, limited to a handful of cities such as Vancouver, Victoria, and Kelowna, while policy support was limited prior to 2024. This project was originally envisioned as filling this gap by creating a provincial inventory of rooftop solar resources. However, this was a bit big in scale for the initial timeline, so we instead looked to reframe the problem. We instead engineered a open source workflow looking to capture solar resources at a city scale, taking specific intention to design it to be open source and easily applied as BC looks to broaden its LiDAR inventory to cover the entire province. City scale analysis was perfect for this case because it allowed us to create meaningful, actionable results while still balancing the intense computational requirements of working with LiDAR data. Kamloops itself stood out as a natural case study for the workflow. Not only does it host a high-quality open source data catalog, sourcing data such as building footprints and high-density LiDAR data, which are used to perform the analysis and validate the results. But it's also excellent in terms of solar resources and support for solar photovoltaic modules. Its location in the southern interior and bordering mountain ranges create a rain shadow effect, leading to dry semi-arid climate and lots of sunlight throughout the year. Before I get into the workflow, I'll give a brief aside about LiDAR for those that are unfamiliar. LiDAR is a remote sensing technology using laser pulses to measure distance to surfaces. A sensor is typically mounted aboard a platform such as an aircraft. When in use, the sensor shoots out pulses of light which bounce off surfaces such as the ground, trees, or rooftops. When bounced back to the sensor, it can then reconstruct a high fidelity three-dimensional image of the target area, in our case, capturing the topography and structure of the city, as you can see in that image on the left. What you can also see here is that throughout the process, we use this LiDAR imagery to generate topographic details and derive information useful for identifying where is the most suitable for solar photovoltaic modules. Generally speaking, we can break the workflow down into 3 major steps. First, we do rooftop identification, taking that original point cloud, isolating rooftop points above 2.5 meters in elevation. We rasterize that into a 2-dimensional image showing the extent and location of each rooftop. Second, we use a solar radiation model to capture annual solar irradiation on surfaces throughout Kamloops. We provide this data sets encoding canopy height and the topography of building and ground points, which allows the model to capture shading effect on solar irradiation throughout the city. And you can see what the output of this stage looks like in the top image on the 3rd column here. Once this has been complete, we can combine the 2 outputs from the previous steps to perform a suitability analysis using rooftop slope, aspect, size, and annual irradiation to determine locations most suitable for solar photovoltaic modules. What you can also notice from the images on the slide here is how important city structure is in determining where locations for solar are ideal. And this shows the importance of using spatial analysis for identifying rooftop solar points in cities. So we ran the initial version of this program last February in Kamloops. With this, we found that there were just over 11 million square meters of rooftop area, just over half of which was suitable for solar photovoltaic modules. On average, these locations received just over 1,100 kilowatt hours per meter squared of insolation throughout the year, and roughly accounting for module efficiency, system loss, and some physical factors, we estimate that Kamloops has a potential annual energy generation of 0.9 terawatts. This number is pretty significant because using the community energy and emission inventory from 2022, Kamloops's annual demand for electricity is approximately 0.8 terawatt hours, meaning by taking advantage of this area, we can make a significant dent in their electricity demand using local renewable resources. Now, to talk a bit about the context surrounding this study and some of the challenges we encountered along the way, the volume of data was one of the huge factors in determining how we approach this analysis. With 300 gigabytes of LiDAR data, we had to limit the spatial resolution to 2 meter pixels, which, while it sounds great in comparison to the size of Kamloops, our object of interest was rooftops, which meant that the size was a bit more coarse, blurring the line where one rooftop might end and another might begin, leading to a bit of an overestimation in rooftop area. Additionally, in practice, there are a bunch of real-world constraints that limit how much of the energy potential that I've mentioned that can actually get used. For example, building code, rooftop obstacles, and social and economic factors all pose limitations on how much energy generation we can actually pull out of that number I provided. Finally, while open source software development is incredible and allows insight to the community, provides transparency, and allows others to build off our work, it also adds complexity and overhead to the development process due to the nature of all the disparate parts that need to be tied together and made to work consistently, efficiently, and accurately. But I think it's well worth the result. Considering all this, what's next for the workflow? Right now, we're going about engaging with stakeholders like you. This means talking to municipal policymakers and industry professionals, making sure that we capture their domain expertise in the workflow, and also making sure that our outputs actually work for them. Additionally, huge effort is being put into improving the analysis. This means refactoring the workflow for computational efficiency, meaning we'll be able to drop the spatial resolution. Additionally, we're looking to plug in new modules into the workflow, such as capturing rooftop obstacles, better capturing the physics of solar irradiation, and also trying to provide an accurate capacity estimate of a hypothetical system. Finally, we're hoping to expand to new areas, try the workflow in new cities to understand how well the model generalizes and what work needs to be done to make it work perfectly. That's all the material I have for you today, but I'd be happy to field any questions, engage in more discussion after we end here. Additionally, I'm always open for contact, and you can reach out to me at the email in the bottom right if you have questions, want to learn more, or have ideas for collaboration. But given that, I will pass it on to my colleague, Kenzie.
Saying hi everyone, I'm Kenzie. Similar to Tyler, I just finished my Master's of Geomatics at UBC, where this project started out as my capstone research. Since then, I'm now a research assistant where I've been continuing this work over the summer. So my work focuses on solar farm site suitability and energy potential analysis in British Columbia. So the main issue or the main challenge here is that solar farm development cannot be at random. Installations need to be strategically placed to be economically viable, environmentally responsible, and operationally efficient. So in light of this challenge, my work breaks this problem down into two stages, with stage one being determining the geographical potential of BC. So this answers the question of where across the province are the best locations for utility scale solar farm. And then secondly, determines the technical potential, which answers the question of how much energy could we generate if we were to develop these sites. The methods follows 4 key stages, starting with the identification of suitability criteria and land constraints, then moves to data processing, then to the analytic hierarchy process for the weighing of the criteria, and lastly to resource calculations. And I'll go into each one of these steps in more detail. So the first step was determining where solar development simply cannot happen, what we call these land constraints. So these are areas excluded from consideration due to environmental, technical, or regulatory reasons. And in this analysis, we've included unsuitable land covers, which are water, wetlands, permanent snow and ice, dense forest, so stand that has a canopy cover greater than 40%, and artificial environments. We've also included the agricultural land reserve, all roads and railways, protected and conserved areas with an ecological buffer, and then infrastructure buffers around roads and cities. So these layers were combined into a single master exclusion zone, which is all of the area highlighted in red on that map there. Okay, so everything in red is off the table before the suitability analysis began. Now, with the constrained areas removed, we went on to evaluating what remained. So we selected 6 criteria across 3 different categories to fully capture the key drivers in solar farm performance and development feasibility. So for climatic criteria, we selected global tilted irradiance, which is the solar energy hitting an optimally tilted solar panel. And this is the key indicator of a farm's performance. For economic criteria, we selected proximity to the grid, also proximity to demand centers, and proximity to major roads. And then lastly, for topographic criteria, we factored in ground slope and ground aspect. Flatter sites are less expensive to build on, and then the ground aspect maximizes the sun received throughout the day. So we're looking for those south-facing slopes in the Northern Hemisphere. Now, each of these layers was processed to a consistent extent, spatial resolution, and standardized 1-to-5 suitability scale that led them to be able to be compared and combined. Now, to actually combine these criteria into a single suitability map, we used a method called the analytic hierarchy process. So the idea here is that rather than assuming all criteria are equally important, we determine how much more important one is relative to the other, and then by how much. So to do this, a small group of solar experts compared each criterion pairwise. They first decided what criteria is more important and then by how much, and they assigned the score using a 9-point scale from 1, which means that the 2 criteria are equally important, to 9, which means that one criteria is extremely more important than the other. So for example, if global tilted irradiance was compared to ground slope and given a score of 9, this means that your solar resource is extremely more important than the slope of the ground in the siting process. These comparisons were made between every pair of criteria, resulting in a complete pairwise comparison matrix, which you can see in the middle image there. And we can see that the global tilted irradiance and the proximity to the grid are our most important factors here with the highest weights. We then ran a weighted sum overlay, which is essentially stacking the layers together to generate our final suitability map. So here are the geographical potential findings. The map shows our restricted areas in gray and then suitability across the province from a yellow to red color gradient, with yellow being our least suitable areas and red being our suitability hotspots. So breaking this down, it was found that roughly 77% of the province was restricted from development, which left about 23% of the province to work with. From this area, just under 0.4% of BC was found to be in our class 4 and class 5, so our most suitable areas, and this equated to just over 3,600 square kilometers. Looking at this breakdown by regional district, the East Kootenay, Thompson-Nicola, and Peace River regional districts were found to have the greatest amount of class 4 and class 5 land. Okay, and that brings us to stage 2, the technical potential findings. So the first step here was filtering sites by size. So a typical utility scale solar farm requires 5 acres of land per 1 megawatt of production. So because we adopted a 1 megawatt minimum production threshold, we filtered out any suitable site that was less than 5 contiguous acres. After filtering, we were left with just under 3,000 square kilometers of suitable sites. And then from there, we moved on to calculate the solar capacity using 5 variables. So the area of the site, a panel efficiency of 23%, latitude-dependent ground cover ratios, which accounts for the spacing needed between the rows of panels to prevent self-shading, packing density ratio factor, which accounts for the difference between the footprint of the solar panel and the total land area of the site, and then a standard test condition output of 1 kilowatt hours per square meters. After applying all these 5 factors, a total capacity of 148 gigawatts was put out for the province. And then to get the annual energy, we multiplied the capacity by the localized average annual energy available at each site, which gave us 191 terawatt hours of annual energy. So just for some context, in 2021, BC's grid capacity was 18.5 gigawatts and the total energy was 71 terawatt hours. So even partial development of these identified sites would contribute a significant amount of energy to our grid. And then lastly, just for some context here, the Site C dam has an annual energy output of 5 terawatt hours. So if we were to develop all these sites, it would be the equivalent to adding 38 Site C dams to the province. Okay, and then to wrap up our next steps, so we're currently working on generating a wider sample of expert opinions to refine these AHP-derived weights. So we've been engaging with regional districts, energy developers, researchers, policy, and we're actively engaging more professionals in this field, including this webinar today, which is awesome. Yeah, we're looking to incorporate this feedback and get input on the technical parameters, which just brings us to a live HP survey we have running right now, where we're looking to collect exactly that kind of feedback. So this is really important because the weights we use derive where suitability is found across the province. So the broader the expertise behind them, the stronger the final result. So if you would like to participate in the survey, just please reach out to Connor at that email there. It will only take a few minutes and your input will immediately shape where the suitability and technology is found across the province. That's all I have for you today. And with that, I will pass it over to Amy.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Kenzie. So hi, everyone. My name's Annie Russell, and I'm a postdoc researcher here at UBC, and I've been working with ASET's team here to understand and dig into BC Hydro's new community generation service rate, which is coming online on July 1st. So I'm excited to be here today, both to walk through the rate, but also to understand your perspectives and questions through the Q&A. So we will have a chance to speak with Hydro in the near future and ask any clarifying questions. So feel free to add those to the chat as well. So to start off, most broadly, community generation is a concept where multiple community members or groups will contribute to a single generating facility and also benefit from that facility in some way. So this allows community members who might not have space to host generation or funds to cover these large upfront costs to still save on their electricity bills while supporting energy security and sovereignty and also low carbon energy sources within their communities. So to date, British Columbians have had access to community generation through community energy co-ops. So this is a process where members have been able to buy a share in the co-op. The co-op will operate the facility under the current net metering rates and offer a return on investment. BC Hydro's new community generation service rate that's coming online is a potential opportunity for more British Columbians to access community generation alongside these types of existing approaches. And ASET is interested in understanding how communities might be going about implementing projects under this rate, including who might benefit within these communities and how. So we do also acknowledge that there is a lot of uncertainty around this rate right now due to the fact that it's a new rate design that doesn't necessarily mimic best practices in other jurisdictions. So we want to be able to contribute to collective learning and research to inform the review in 2030, as this rate is subject to change in 2031. So for a bit more context, BC Hydro is bringing on 2 new self-generation rates beginning on July 1st. And these are going to replace the net metering rate that's currently available. So electricity that's exported to the grid will be compensated now at 10 cents per kilowatt hour. It's important to note that this will affect the payback time of some existing systems. And these rates are going to be applicable to any clean or renewable resources. So the first rate is called the self-generation service rate, and this is targeted toward individual customers, be it residential or general service. And instead of having a size limit or capacity limit for the system, as was the case before, there's now an injection limit. So this limits the amount of power that can be exported to the grid at any given time. So that's 100 kilowatts for single phase systems and will be 300 kilowatts for larger three-phase systems. So in this case, the generating customer gets to keep all of the net generating credits, those 10 cents per kilowatt hour. For the community generation service rate that we're talking about today, that injection limit increases to up to 2 megawatts, both for systems with a load and without a load. So in this case, that allows these projects to access these economies of scale, which drive down your installed cost per watt for example, in the case of solar. And to access this rate, the generating customer needs to share their net generation credits with other customers. So how that works is that this generating customer is called the community generator. And behind their meter, there is a shared generating facility. And optionally, there can also be the community generator's load. Any net generation that's exported to the grid is going to be compensated at that 10 cents per kilowatt hour. And once per billing cycle, BC Hydro will send that community generation credit to the community generator account. It's the community generator's responsibility to share these credits with a set of customers, of other BC Hydro customers that are called benefiting customers. And at some point, in all likelihood, but not necessarily, these benefiting customers will have contributed funds to the facility, either through upfront capital shares or through a subscription. Now, BC Hydro is going to offer an optional credit billing service to apply these credits and the share of credits automatically to benefiting customers' accounts. That'll be free for 2 years, but will be billed on a cost recovery basis after that. So the actual agreement that goes into this credit sharing is up to the parties involved. The community generator must just provide a record of benefiting customers and their share of credits to BC Hydro. The community generator, again, is responsible for distributing those credits, but can also keep a portion of the credits as a benefiting customer. The benefiting customers themselves don't actually have to be physically connected to the facility, but they do have to be a BC Hydro account holder, and they can't participate in more than one shared generation facility at a time, and they can't be subscribed to another self-generation rate, so they can't have rooftop solar in their house, for example. One rule that does apply is that as the number of benefiting customers increases in the project, the actual maximum share that the community generator can keep of those credits will decrease. So for projects that have more than 10 benefiting customers, the community generator has to share 90% of those generation credits. I've been talking about this 2 megawatt injection limit. That's actually a maximum. So the actual injection limit that will work for a facility depends on the number of individually metered residential benefiting customers and the number of general service benefiting customers. So as you increase the number of benefiting customers, you're increasing your injection limit, which allows you to access those economies of scale. And to reach this maximum, both for a system with and without a load, you'll need 84 residential customers, 20 general service customers, or a mix thereof. And again, in this case, the community generator, because of this net generation limit and the number of benefiting customers, will have to share their 90% of their net generation credits. In a case with no load or storage, all of the generation is net generation. So that is shared between the benefiting customers, depending on the agreement. And in a case with a load, the benefiting customers only have access to that net generation that is in excess of the energy demand of the load. So community generators will save 7 to 14 cents per kilowatt hour when demand is offset by the local generation, depending on their current electricity price, as well as saving on any demand charges. For a case with storage, as a battery charges, that's essentially adding another load, and so you're reducing the number of net generation credits available, but the the community generator will save more when the battery discharges. So this is just an example to show that it's important to understand and get good estimates of generation, demand, and net generation in order to understand who will benefit and when. So some questions that we're starting to consider alongside communities are, might the purpose of a generating facility be? Is it savings, security, sovereignty, and how might that impact the rate that is chosen, whether there's load or storage, and whether there are any opportunities to say hit two birds with one stone, like combining community generation with social housing? Who might participate and how? So what's going to motivate these different customer types, residential, these small, medium, and large general service benefiting customers to get involved, and also what types of partnerships might make these projects possible. In terms of who will benefit, again, getting a good understanding of those financial benefits, but as well any non-financial benefit that the community might see, as well as trying to figure out what opportunities might be available for community members to contribute to the systems without those large upfront costs. So that might look like subscribing to savings on a monthly basis and receiving those on your bill. And it might look like understanding best practices around the world, including states in the US that require that a portion of subscriptions be set aside for equity deserving groups, such as low to middle income customers. When it comes to where the facility might be, that might come down to some renewable resource mapping, understanding whether leases for land or rooftop space might affect the project economics, as well as understanding any areas that might be off limits due to zoning or permitting, and also any cost prohibitive system upgrades that would be required to actually interconnect to the system. So when we're looking at these projects, we can think about potential enablers, which might include on the financial side, again, taking advantage of those larger injection limits to drive down your cost per watt of installed capacity, as well as maybe looking at some collective buying power between communities or projects. Also taking advantage of BC Hydro's solar rebates, which change depending on the customer type, as well as load displacement incentives for larger loads that can cover up to 100% of the capital costs of solar, as well as the federal clean technology investment tax credit, which for some eligible generating customers will allow that 30% reduction in capital costs. When it comes to actually where these systems might interconnect, larger systems with larger injection limits are going to have to go through BC Hydro's system impact study process, which can take 4 to 12 months and cost $50,000 to $130,000. So it's important that we use the enabler of the first step of that process, which is this basic distribution system information request, where you can ask BC Hydro about the location and design of a project for a specific facility before you get too far down the road of designing and getting involved with different partners. When it comes to having folks actually start to begin the process of developing or adopting or exploring, knowledge sharing is going to be really key to figure out what is and isn't possible within this space. Additionally, having any sort of public education and toolkits to help inform compliance on any regulatory issues will be really key as well. So some potential uncertainties that we'll all be looking into as a province is really understanding whether these projects can be economically viable for different participants and how. Those questions of interconnection that I've already discussed, as well as thanks to Rob Baxter at VREC and SoulShare for describing a case with the BC Securities Act and how these credit sharing agreements may fall within that act and what those implications might be. So understanding that will be really key, as well as the 2030 review coming up and the fact that communities might have to mitigate the risk associated with any rate changes down the line. So looking at how communities might do that. Finally, potentially looking at participants or British Columbians who might not have access to this rate, including those in non-integrated areas where the self-generation limit has been met, or those who don't have access to a BC Hydro account but still pay utility bills. So as a summary, BC Hydro's new community generation service rate is coming in July 1st and is subject to change. It's a potential pathway for more British Columbians to benefit from self-generation, but there are a number of uncertainties that need to be resolved along the way to implementing these projects. And that's where ACID comes in. So ACID is looking at community partnered research to help understand the implementation of these projects and also to contribute to that collective learning to inform the 2030 review. So if you want to know any more about ACID's projects, you can visit uvic.ca/ACID for more information. And please do contact Connor about Kenzie's survey as well to put your input in for the AHP. So we're happy to answer your questions. Really looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, big thank you. Big thank you to the energy mapping team. We've had a lot of great discussion questions trickling in during the course of the presentation. So just a reminder to those in the chat, you can look at the Q&A questions, and the team's getting snug there. I love it. You can look at the Q&A and you can upvote questions that you'd like to get answered in priority, just in case we run out of time today. However, we do have some contact information on the screen here for any follow-up questions. So we'll start with the most upvoted question in the chat. So this comes in about particularly around the exclusion of ALR, and we're wondering about the exclusion of the ALR. So a little bit of background on that is I believe this was a recent decision to allow generation through things like agrivoltaics or wind, and to kind of support that farm income while allowing for generation to occur, through regular farm use. Yeah, so I'll turn that over to you folks.
Yeah, wonderful. So the exclusion of the ALR was decided upon just to preserve that arable agricultural land. The inclusion of the ALR has been brought up consistently throughout this engagement process. So probably for once we get all the feedback from our survey and the technical parameters, I imagine that a lot of people will have a preference to include the ALR. So likely moving forward, that will be a revision to the model that we incorporate. We've also thought about breaking the ALR down by soil quality. So they have 7 different classes. So we might look into, only excluding the class 1 and class 2, which is the most arable land in the AR, and kind of breaking it down that way. But yeah, the point of agrivoltaics, it's a wonderful consideration. And yeah, moving forward, we will definitely be likely considering including the ALR in the study area. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really cool intersection to see, farm use mixed with generation, and yeah, I hope to see more of that in the future. This one, a little bit of a question, a little bit of a plug here. Are you familiar with some of the work with Rob Baxter at SoulShare? There's an upcoming film this Thursday in Vancouver that speaks a little bit more about their work.
Yeah, I would think that if anybody is in the Vancouver area, it would be awesome to see you all at that event. We're going to be attending, so that'll be wonderful. And yeah, I think Rob's points on the BC Securities Act and this community generation rate is really, really key within this. And I think, he could speak that more at the event if he's interested. But really, I think what's important is as we move forward with this rate, really trying to incorporate the voices that already understand the space in a huge way into this conversation is really key. Because that may have been missed along the road in different ways. And so as we move forward with what we've got for the next 5 years, really trying to convene everyone who has a expertise in the space can be really key.
Great. Okay. Do you know if there'll be popcorn at the movie?
Might be BOYP.
Okay. So here's a question just on some of the modeling work that you've done. How or did the model account for shading or potential shading of rooftops?
Oh yeah, I think that's pretty relevant.
Yeah, so in the process, we used a model called SEBE. It stands for Solar Energy on Building Envelopes. So we didn't design the model ourselves, but the model was made by Frederick Lindbergh out of University of Gothenburg in 2015. And essentially how it works is it takes those topographic data sets I mentioned earlier. So there's one of canopy height and another detailing the topography of the ground and buildings. So it uses those two data sets, essentially blowing them up into 3D. And it models the sun going over, I think, 145 different ways, calculating the shade for each of those paths and how it works while it's along those paths. And that's how it's able to account for shading. So it's essentially overlapping those two data sets. Vegetation has a bit different transmissivity, so it even includes some of the fact that vegetation doesn't completely shade, but it's mostly by deriving 3D information from those 2D data sets I mentioned.
Okay. Okay, so has there been any verification of the modeled potential to the potential that is actually realized? So the example here is, have you been able to obtain any data from any existing solar systems within the study area?
Yeah, we haven't cross-validated the energy output with those existing solar farms, but we have done an accuracy assessment for the geographical potential, basically seeing how well the suitability map held up against where existing solar farms are. And in that context, it has been performing well. Interesting enough, places where it does diverge is actually when solar farms are situated on the ALR, and that's just another fun point there. But yeah, that's definitely a point to come of assessing the accuracy of our energy estimates against these actual solar farms. But yeah, that's in the process.
Yeah.
For Tyler's work, we are working on getting data from BC Hydro on the amount of solar panels in each municipality. Robin Webb from BC Hydro has been very helpful there to try to get us that aggregated data so we can see how much solar is installed at the municipal level and compared to our estimate, or maybe even at a census or kind of sub-parcel level. And then we're also looking at what type of systems people are installing. So are they doing solar plus battery? Because we're going to hopefully go towards having a cost estimate, and then the battery has a big impact on that.
Of course, yeah. See how that could dovetail nicely into a longer study if you're able to compare some of the installations that went in after this mapping project has been done as well. So lots of cool options there. Okay, we've got lots of great questions rolling in. Thank you for just the attentive chat today, everybody. So if solar was rolled out on a large scale, how do you foresee making it grid stable? Is it because the generation is low and localized so the grid can accommodate the variable nature of the power?
Yeah, I mean, for the simplest, BC Hydro has massive storage obviously already with the hydro dams, so it's kind of very well placed to integrate renewables compared to other places that don't have those large hydro dams. I think storage is a much more large problem. It's sort of beyond the scope of our work that how much the solar integration works within the grid, but we are engaging with the Sustainable Energy Systems Integration Team Transitions group over in UVic, Madeline McPherson, and then also there's the SFU Delta E group. They do more long-term electricity planning studies, so we're hoping to compare what they have in there for their assumptions around solar and try to improve the spatial disaggregation in those long-term planning models to understand a bit better, yeah, what the actual technical deployable amount would be and those impacts, yeah, on storage. So another question that came up was the batteries and if we're mapping where you put the batteries with the solar. But it's a little beyond the scope of what we're doing now. This is kind of just the theoretical maximum.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for that. So here's a question. Interaction of community generation and virtual power plant concept. So for those who don't know, the virtual power plant is kind of, instead of having one large physical power plant, you have that connection of lots of smaller kind of behind the meter systems. So do we have any sense, or have we looked at the interaction of that community generation and what this virtual power plant concept, how they might interact for this project?
Yeah, it's a good question. We haven't looked into it yet. I think it's something that Hydro can look at in the future, for sure. The idea of aggregation did come up in the BCUC proceeding, and it was certainly not taken into account in the actual rate design itself. So I think looking at aggregation both on the demand side in terms of being able to aggregate in more virtual net metering kind of style, where you can aggregate your demand in across different customers as well might be interesting. So yeah, aggregation both on supply and demand is going to be key in the future, and is not currently, from what I can see, available within the rate.
Okay, so this question is also about the community generation service rate, and is the 2 megawatt injection limit per phase similar to how the 100 kilowatt limit was also calculated?
Not that I know of. I think that's the 200 megawatt limit in general. I don't think it's a per phase value. Yeah.
Okay. Another question on this one. When you say 100 kilowatts, does this mean up to 100 kilowatt solar system, which could produce more than that limit at the peak of the day?
Yeah, so that 100 kilowatts is now an injection limit, so that it's at the peak of the day at your lowest load. Then you're going to be injecting 100 kilowatts of power at that given instant onto the system. And so you'd have to size your system to make sure that that is the case.
Okay. Now, this is kind of shifting a little bit to some kind of future planning by BC Hydro, but has this work been integrated, or have you provided input into BC Hydro's integrated resource plan?
We've engaged with BC Hydro and it's been relatively well received. I don't know if we could say it's being integrated or taken up by their IRP team, but it's something we're working on definitely and trying to push that needle. I know BC Hydro seems to have a favor for large, stable capacity rather than distributed solar. So I think we're just trying to move the needle a little bit towards maybe thinking solar is a viable option. And yeah, it's definitely a discussion we've had. And the maps have been very well received with BC Hydro people we've engaged with so far. They're a key partner for us in understanding some of the technical limitations around distance to grid and what type of substations we're dealing with.
Right, yeah, which are all just absolutely critical pieces to the rollout of this. Here's a question for kind of a question comment for Mackenzie. The comparison to Site C is a difficult one, as Site C is firm and year round, whereas solar is energy only and has its peaks in the summer and during the day. So the orientation and tilt of the panels will affect output, and possibly the value of power would vary with time today and monthly output as well. So not sure if there's a question buried in there. Do you maybe have a comment on that, Kenzie?
No, that's a very good point. Yeah, right now we've just been considering one type of system, a fixed tilt system, but yeah, that's definitely a really good consideration. I was just kind of putting that forth as a nice analogy, but yeah, definitely moving forward, I'll have to keep that in mind.
We should say that we've assumed an optimal tilt on the panels, so the further north ones are, tilted further up to face the latitude better. So it's a fixed tilted and optimal tilted for the global tilted irradiance. And then, yeah, I mean, I suppose this is linked to the earlier question on the variability of the source and the seasonality. Solar is going to peak in the summer, which maybe not the best time for the hydro, but with the hydro dam, you can always store the water as well as the purpose of a reservoir. Something came up in our discussions yesterday. Was an interesting idea of putting the solar panels on top of the hydro dam reservoirs because you've already got large transmission there. So maybe there's a way to try to link up the two. And yeah, I think BC has got abundant, cheap, clean electricity at the moment, but it's not always going to have that if the demand keeps growing. So you need to explore these other sources and figure out how you're going to bring them in.
So we've got a couple BC Hydro specific questions. I'll throw them out to you folks, but just understanding that, we might not have the information at this time. Do you know if BC Hydro, are you aware if they have any targets for solar derived power? The example here is, a percentage of total supply or megawatt hours that might help drive some of these programs that include community generation?
That's a very good question.
So I would point folks to an analysis done by Dunsky on distributed energy resources right now in the province. So that's, I think, been commissioned by Hydro and is going to be moving forward with a more detailed analysis as well. So I'm sure that those will be numbers coming out. But there is one of the things that came out of the BCUC proceeding is that there is no specific policy mandate for distributed energy over any other form of energy, and so that's where those targets don't currently exist in that way.
Okay, so if that's something that folks were passionate in seeing, that would be something that they would work with the BCUC on, and then drive that change to the utilities.
Yeah.
So, bit of a technical question here. What is the mechanism, or how do you connect a community solar generator to the hydro grid?
Yeah, so the community solar for in the context of the community generation rate will be a behind the meter system. So this means that your system is connected behind your normal utility meter. And so on the grid side, BC Hydro is just seeing the energy, the net energy, so that's either supplied or drawn from the grid at any given time. So the process for interconnection will require that system impact study that I mentioned. So for larger systems, BC Hydro will be a key part in determining whether that system can go onto the grid at the location that you've requested, and would also ask any kind of system upgrades that are needed. Sometimes you have to upgrade the transformer that is nearest to your line or that you're connecting with. So there are sometimes or even more significant upgrades depending on the system type. So that's again a process that you go through with Hydro, but it is a behind the meter system for the community generation rate.
I found, oh, sorry. Do you have any more to add that? No.
Nope.
Okay. I just kind of scrolling through the questions here, found one that is kind of aligned with something I believe Connor just mentioned, which was floating solar. And has that factored into any of the studies that you've done to date?
No, that's a plug for our future work. Only started thinking about it the last couple of weeks. We've excluded water at the moment, but I think it's an interesting area to explore, definitely.
Yeah, that's something we've looked at a high level here at the City of Penticton for some of our reservoirs as well. As there's a lot of, no pun intended, moving parts with that, but you have that reduced evaporation and
Yeah, reduced evaporation, the panels work better because it's colder. And,
yeah, so there's
it makes
definitely,
sense.
well, I'm looking forward to that future study whenever that already. Just kind of on the topic of studies, are you aware of any case studies that have been completed that outline the return on investment for participation in community generation? So as an example, maybe like a strata complex or apartment towers or anything like that.
That's a good question. Right now, I don't have those case studies in mind off the top of my head. But I know that again, under the existing community generation and in BC, return on investment has come about through those solar co-ops, and that's a different model than is suggested under this community generation rate. And so really the model of like compensation and who is providing funds to the system is really going to be different for this rate than for existing rates elsewhere and in other jurisdictions. So case studies are going to be useful to some degree, but not necessarily a cut and paste. So yeah, I'm sure there are case studies out there that can provide more information on that ROI, but again, just keeping in mind that it's going to be different within this context.
Yeah, I'm aware of it's outside of the BC Hydro area, but City of Nelson has a solar garden that, gosh, is probably went in the late 2010s, and I know they had a few fact sheets about that on their website as well at one point. So yeah, just kind of building on that kind of community generation. Do we know of any jurisdictions to date that have that community generation and any experiences that we've learned from those communities?
Yeah, so generally, community generation happens across the world. Within the US right now, community solar has been ongoing for decades now, including those kind of on-bill credits and those subscriptions that I was mentioning. And so the National Renewable Energy Laboratory has a number of good, well, no, an RL, but they have a number of good analyses on best practices within that space of community solar in particular. For other types of community generation, for the other energy sources, I'm not as familiar with those. But yeah, there's lots of best practices around community solar out there. Again, we'll have to fit them within this definition of the rate and the mechanics of the rate. I think learnings there on equity are a really big piece of that. So particularly in the States, the fact that some of those subscriptions have to be set aside for those low to middle income communities has really dictated who benefits from these types of systems and who doesn't. And so I can see if our community generation rate or other types of community generation that happens in the province in the future, if it goes forward without considerations like that, you're going to get a really different group of beneficiaries on the whole.
Yeah, it's nice to learn of those requirements in place, especially down in the United States. And maybe just a note to the BCSEA team that could be an engaging future webinar or article. Keep folks more informed. We have a couple questions here. Kenzie, you might have touched on this briefly. So one question came in was, I believe the introduction slides touched on wind energy. What is your perspective on community generation via wind? Is this practical for communities? Is there strong enough generation potential and any applicability within BC Hydro's framework?
Yeah, our wind assessment does follow the same methodology. We just have the initial analysis ran from another student in our program. Kind of you want to touch on?
Yeah, we only showed a solar because the method's basically the same, but we've done a similar assessment for the wind. We were looking at more large scale there probably rather than the smaller solar for if it's like the community generation rate, the 2 megawatts. I mean, that would be a single turbine, I think, with most of the modern turbines. But it's something definitely to consider when we go forward. We're going to do the maps as wind and solar, and the survey covers both.
And for the community generation rate, again, it just has to be a clean or renewable resource under the BC Clean Energy Act. So it is, wind is included. And yeah, there have been communities in BC and the Yukon who've looked at single turbines as options for sure.
And wind's definitely been the most popular technology if you look at the call for power so far, because it's cheaper than solar and it can go larger, so it can absorb those costs of connection to the grid a bit better.
But that question of economics on the single turbine is interesting versus solar. I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, I was recently at a renewable energy in the Southern Interior conference, and they were showcasing some of the large wind installations that are coming online over the next few years, and some of the enormous generation behind those. So that'll be interesting to watch those unfold. So here's a bit of a technical question. Can you confirm the project and the community served by the project do not have to have any geographic connection, assuming they are all on the BC Hydro grid?
Yes, so the community generator who has the facility behind their meter is a BC Hydro customer. All of the benefiting customers are also BC Hydro customers, but they do not have to be located. There's like no geographical connection anymore between the two. So, yeah.
So here's a question that I was hoping to ask today. Where do you see local governments playing the most effective role in enabling community generation? Would that be planning, financing, partnerships, or maybe something else?
Yeah, I can take that one. Coming from Europe or Ireland, where we have much more, I suppose, planning on renewables at the local government level already. I think there's some examples we can maybe take from there. Planning is definitely a key role local government can play. In Ireland, local councils are encouraged to develop spatial maps of where is acceptable for renewables when they do their 6-year annual cycle for their forward planning. So they have local authority renewable energy strategies that'll identify areas that are not suitable for wind, areas that might be suitable for wind, and areas that are suitable for wind. And I think this takes a lot of the issue out of permitting and then a lot of the cost as well that projects face up front in trying to determine feasibility. So having that kind of, more spatially led and planning led approach of this is definitely areas that we're open for consideration, I think is a great role the local government could play. There's also a lot in terms of partnership, I think, obviously, because there's a lot of processes you have to go through with planning and permitting that the local government can help with. But then I think the financing is maybe a difficult one because I know municipalities are stretched. But public buildings are definitely an option that we've seen in the community generation rate and on the rooftop. A lot of public buildings are large flat surfaces if they're community centers or schools and stuff. So these are really good places for solar. So there's a little bit of leadership role that you can play there as well.
Yeah, and a great example was in your slides earlier. Hudson Hope. I think Hudson Hope has the most generation per capita of maybe any community, and they have that great solar wave. I think I saw in one of the earlier slides there, which helps shade the grassy area at their public pools. So I toured Hudson Hope about a year ago and was just blown away by how much solar they were able to install, and in such a northern part of the province. We do have a lot of great questions still yet to be answered. Unfortunately, we are kind of coming to the end of this webinar today. We do have Connor's contact information here on the screen. So if you have any questions, you can reach out directly to Connor. If you have any questions on the community generation rate, you can reach out to Annie, and it's annie.russell@ubc.ca. You can also send any questions or comments to us at info@bcsea.org. If you enjoyed this webinar so much you'd like to see it again, you will be able to stream it through the news page of bcsea.org in a few days. Just as a reminder, BCSEA is a volunteer-led registered charity. Your memberships and donations make webinars, events, and online resources possible. So please become a member and donate if you can. If you have ideas for future webinars, and there was, I think, a few today on sustainable energy that would support our education mandate, please do get in touch through info@bcsea.org. But with that, I'd like to extend a very warm thank you to the ASET and UBC Energy Mapping team for taking the time to be with us today. In the questions and answers, there was a lot of kudos to you folks for the work you're doing. I'd also like to thank our very own Cindy Jarvis and Neil Andrews for all the behind-the-scenes actions that makes this webinar possible. And thank you for everyone for listening and sending in your questions and comments. There's great discussions today. With that, please keep an eye on the bcsea.org website and social media channels for any future webinars and events.